Welcome to Historical Legacies. Here, we dive into history's most intriguing stories, unraveling mysteries and uncovering truths from the past. Subscribe to join our journey through time's greatest moments. James Connolly, the man who dared to dream. Introduction. James Connolly was more than a revolutionary. He was a man who dared to dream of an Ireland free from oppression, an Ireland where workers had dignity, and where the poor had a voice. Born into hardship, raised in the slums of Edinburgh, and hardened by the struggles of the working class, Connolly's journey was one of defiance and determination. He was not just a soldier, but a thinker, a writer, and a leader who saw the fight for Ireland's independence as inseparable from the fight for social justice. His vision of a just society, free from both British rule and economic exploitation, placed him at the heart of Ireland's revolutionary movement. Connolly was fearless in his beliefs, standing shoulder to shoulder with laborers in strikes, and with revolutionaries in battle. But his story is not just one of ideals. It is a tale of struggle, betrayal, and ultimate sacrifice. Part 1. Born in Chains: The Struggles of an Irish Boy in Scotland. James Connolly was born into a world of hardship, a reality shaped long before he took his first breath. His parents, Irish immigrants fleeing famine and destitution, settled in Edinburgh's Cowgate district, a slum so densely packed with the impoverished that it was known as Little Ireland. The narrow streets were filled with desperation, disease spread unchecked, hunger gnawed at families, and prejudice followed the Irish wherever they went. In this bleak environment, Connolly took his first steps, not in the halls of privilege, but in the gutters of oppression. From an early age, he learned that survival demanded more than just endurance; it required defiance. Education was a luxury his family could not afford, and before he had the chance to grasp the full weight of his potential, poverty forced him into labor. By the age of 10, Connolly was already working, his small hands grasping tools instead of books, his days consumed by the relentless grind of industrial labor. The factory floors were merciless, filled with choking dust and the unending clatter of machines that cared little for the frailty of a child. Yet, it was not just poverty that shaped him. It was the weight of his Irish heritage in a land that saw his people as outsiders. The Scots viewed Irish immigrants with suspicion, blaming them for driving down wages and increasing competition for jobs. Anti-Irish sentiment ran deep, with slurs muttered in the streets and barriers erected against opportunity. Young Connolly watched as his father and brother struggled to find steady work, their toil undervalued, their dignity tested at every turn. These early wounds cut deep, planting the first seeds of his defiance against the structures that sought to keep his people in chains. Despite the crushing weight of his circumstances, there was something within Connolly that refused to be broken. He was not content to simply endure. He wanted to understand why the world was as it was. Even as he labored in the factories, he listened to the whispered discontent of workers, the murmurs of rebellion against an unjust system. The bitterness of the working class, their exhaustion, their quiet fury, all of it left a mark on him. It was here, amid the clanging of metal and the suffocating factory air, that his first sparks of political awareness ignited. One story from his childhood lingers in memory, a moment when young Connolly, after an exhausting day of work, sat on a doorstep watching men in fine coats stroll past without a glance at the slum's suffering. He clenched his fists, not in anger but in silent determination, as if vowing that one day he would be more than just another forgotten soul among the poor. That moment, though small, was a turning point, a realization that the world did not have to be this way. As Connolly grew, so did his awareness that poverty was not just misfortune, but a condition imposed by those who held power. The factories, the slums, the prejudice, all were symptoms of a deeper disease, one that could be fought. He did not yet have the words for it, but he carried the conviction in his heart. The struggle that would define his life had already begun. Part 2. A Soldier's Choice: The Young Connolly and the British Army. Desperation often forces men into choices they would never otherwise make. For James Connolly, the crushing weight of poverty left him with few options. At around 14 years old, he made a decision that would haunt him. He lied about his age and enlisted in the British Army. It was not a choice made out of loyalty or belief in empire. It was survival. The army promised food, shelter, and a wage, things his family could barely provide. With his older brother already enlisted, it seemed a natural if bitter path to follow. Connolly was sent to Ireland, the very land of his ancestors, yet not as a liberator, but as an enforcer of British rule. The irony was not lost on him. He marched through streets where Irish laborers toiled under landlords who cared nothing for their suffering. His uniform marked him as an agent of imperial control, the same power that had driven his family into the slums of Edinburgh. Each day, he witnessed firsthand the contempt with which the British treated the Irish, beatings in the streets, forced evictions, and the cold efficiency of military suppression. At first, he tried to suppress the unease growing inside him, convincing himself that a soldier's duty was not to question but to obey. Yet the orders he followed became harder to ignore. One incident stayed with him, a routine patrol in a quiet Irish village. A tenant farmer, gaunt with hunger, had fallen behind on his rent. Connolly and his fellow soldiers were ordered to oversee the eviction. The man pleaded, not for himself, but for his children, their hollow eyes watching from the doorway. The officer in charge did not hesitate. The family was forced into the streets, their home left empty for the next tenant who could pay. Connolly stood frozen, watching the children clutch their mother's skirt as their father collapsed onto his knees. Something inside him cracked. This was not justice, it was cruelty. Though the army had given him discipline, training, and survival, it had also stripped away any illusions he might have had about British rule. His time in uniform was meant to mold him into a loyal soldier, but instead, it sharpened his hatred for the system he served. He studied the tactics of command, the way orders were given and battles were organized. He learned how to fight, but more importantly, he learned how the British thought. These lessons, though painful, would one day serve him well. Other soldiers viewed Connolly with a mix of curiosity and caution. He was not the loudest in the ranks, nor the most rebellious, but there was something in his gaze that set him apart. He carried an intensity that unsettled some and intrigued others. While many saw the army as a career, he saw it as a cage. Each day his resentment grew. He could not be part of this machine of oppression. He had to escape. After several years of service, Connolly made his final choice. He deserted. It was a dangerous decision, one that could have cost him everything. But to him, staying was far worse. He slipped away, vanishing from military life, leaving behind the uniform that had bound him to a system he despised. The British Army had tried to shape him, but in the end, it only made him more determined to fight against everything it stood for. What began as a means of survival had become a crucible of ideology. Connolly left the army not as a lost soldier, but as a man who had found his cause. His days of marching under another's banner were over. Now he would carve his own path. Part 3: A Worker's Fight. Discovering Socialism in the Factories. James Connolly's escape from the British Army had freed him from one kind of oppression, but it led him straight into another. Deserters had no safety, no security, and no easy path forward. With no formal education and few connections, he had little choice but to take whatever work he could find. Factories, mills, and construction sites became his new battleground, places where men and women toiled for hours on end, breaking their bodies for a wage that barely kept them alive. But Connolly soon realized that he was not alone in his suffering. Across the industrial slums, he found countless others trapped in the same relentless cycle of labor and poverty. The factories were brutal. Long shifts in poorly ventilated buildings, machinery that maimed without consequence, and overseers who punished the weak or slow. Workers were treated as little more than tools, discarded when broken, replaced without hesitation. Connolly felt the same helplessness he had seen in the Irish tenant farmers forced from their homes. But there was something else, a fire simmering beneath the surface. In the break rooms, in the taverns, in whispered conversations over clanking machines, there was talk of resistance. Some spoke of unions, others of strikes, and a few even of revolution. It was in one of these dark, smoke-filled rooms that Connolly first encountered true socialist thought. A fellow worker, a man named Peter Maguire, handed him a pamphlet one evening after a grueling shift. "Read this," he said, his voice low but urgent. "It'll explain why we live like this, and why it doesn't have to be this way." Connolly took it, skeptical at first, but as he read, something inside him shifted. The pamphlet spoke of the working class not as a broken mass to be pitted, but as a force that, if united, could bring the powerful to their knees. It was the first time he saw his suffering not as a personal misfortune, but as part of a vast, deliberate system designed to keep workers powerless. From that moment on, he devoured every book, pamphlet, and newspaper article he could find on labor rights, Marxism, and revolutionary movements across the world. He listened intently at meetings, absorbing the words of men who had fought for workers before him. The speeches electrified him. These were not the empty platitudes of politicians, but the calls of men who had seen the same injustice and refused to submit. The more Connolly learned, the angrier he became. He had once accepted his fate as an inevitable consequence of his birth. Now he saw it as a lie. A deliberate deception meant to keep workers from realizing their power. But knowledge alone was not enough. Connolly wanted action. He began speaking up in meetings, not just listening but arguing, debating, pushing others to demand more. At work, he grew bolder, challenging foremen who overworked their men, demanding fair wages, questioning why owners grew rich while their laborers starved. It did not go unnoticed. His employers saw him as a troublemaker, a dangerous agitator who needed to be silenced. When he was fired from one job, he found another undeterred, more determined than ever. A turning point came when he witnessed a fellow worker, a young Irishman barely older than a boy, collapse at his station from exhaustion. Instead of being helped, the foreman cursed at him, ordering him back to work. When the boy could not stand, he was dragged out like a broken piece of machinery, discarded as useless. Connolly clenched his fists, the anger rising in his chest like fire. Enough. He could not simply endure this any longer. He had to fight. He began writing, pouring his thoughts onto paper, sending articles to labor newspapers, calling for workers to rise against the men who saw them as disposable. His words carried the same intensity that had burned within him for years, and they found an audience. The more he wrote, the more people listened. The more they listened, the more they questioned. And the more they questioned, the closer they came to action. For Connolly, the struggle of the worker and the struggle for Ireland were one and the same. The English crown and the factory owner were no different. They both thrived on the suffering of the poor. If Ireland was to be free, its people had to be free, not just from British rule, but from the chains of poverty and exploitation. He had once worn a soldier's uniform, carrying a rifle for a cause he did not believe in. Now his weapon was his voice, his pen, his unwavering conviction. The factories had not just given him work, they had given him purpose. He was no longer just a man trying to survive. He was a fighter, a revolutionary, and he was just getting started. Part 4. The Pen and the Protest, Writing for Revolution. James Connolly had always been a fighter, but now he had found his sharpest weapon, his words. He had seen the factories break men, the slums crush families, and the wealthy grow richer on the backs of starving laborers. But he also saw something else, hope. Hope in the whispered conversations of workers gathering in secret, in the clenched fists of men who refused to bow, in the fire of those who still believed change was possible. If revolution was to come, it needed more than anger. It needed direction, it needed unity, and it needed a voice. Connolly was determined to be that voice. His first articles were raw, urgent, filled with the frustration of a man who had seen too much injustice to remain silent. He wrote about the factories, the working conditions, the cruelty of the employers who crushed men's bodies and souls without a second thought. He exposed the grinding poverty that left families starving while their labor made others wealthy. And he did not shy away from the truth. Britain's rule over Ireland was not just a political occupation, but an economic stranglehold. The same system that oppressed Irish workers in Dublin was crushing the poor in Glasgow, in Liverpool, in London. Capitalism, in its current form, was a weapon used against the working class, and Connolly was determined to break it. His words struck a nerve. Labor newspapers began publishing his work, and soon his articles were being read in workers' homes, on factory floors, in the dimly lit halls where socialists gathered to dream of a better world. He did not just write about suffering, he wrote about resistance, about workers standing together, refusing to be trampled, demanding fair wages, humane conditions, and dignity. He urged them to see their power, to recognize that without them, factories would grind to a halt, cities would cease to function, and those who claimed to own everything would be left with nothing. But Connolly was never content with just writing. He believed words had to lead to action. He attended meetings, gave speeches, and pushed for workers to organize. He understood that ideas alone would not bring change. Only unity and decisive action could. His growing influence brought him into contact with leading socialist thinkers, men who had spent their lives fighting for the rights of workers. Some welcomed him as a comrade, others dismissed him as too radical, too reckless. But Connolly did not waver. He knew that real change never came from those who played it safe. The authorities took notice. The more Connolly wrote, the more dangerous he became in their eyes. His articles were banned in some places, his speeches disrupted by police, and employers blacklisted him from factory work. But for Connolly, there was no turning back. The more they tried to silence him, the louder he became. A defining moment came when a group of workers, inspired by his writings, staged a strike against unfair wages. The employers refused to negotiate, and the police were called in to break the protest. Men were beaten, arrested, thrown into cells without trial. Connolly arrived at the scene not as a passive observer, but as a leader. He stood with the workers, his voice rising above the chaos, refusing to be intimidated. When the newspapers condemned the strike as the work of agitators, he fired back, writing a scathing response that exposed the brutality of those in power. He named the employers responsible, laid out the lies printed in the press, and declared that if fighting for justice made him an agitator, then so be it. His words did more than inspire, they united. Workers who had once felt powerless now saw a path forward. They saw that they were not alone. They saw that resistance was possible. And with every article, every speech, every protest, Connolly's influence grew. But he was not just fighting for workers. He was fighting for Ireland. In his mind, the two battles were one and the same. An independent Ireland meant nothing if it was still ruled by landlords and factory owners, who kept the people in chains. Freedom had to be complete. It had to be political, social, and economic. Otherwise, the revolution would be a lie. Connolly was no longer just a writer. He was a leader. And the world was beginning to take notice. Part 5. Crossing the Atlantic. The American Years and the Industrial Struggles. James Connolly had always believed that the fight for workers' rights and national freedom could not be confined to one country alone. When he boarded a ship to America in 1902, it was not to escape the struggle in Ireland, but to expand it. The streets of Dublin and Belfast had shown him poverty, but in America, he would witness exploitation on a massive scale. The promise of the land of opportunity had lured millions of immigrants across the ocean, but for many, it was a cruel deception. They had traded one form of oppression for another. The same factories, the same slums, the same brutal conditions, Connolly saw it for what it was, a system built on wealth for the few and suffering for the many. From the moment he arrived, Connolly immersed himself in the labor movement. He traveled from city to city, speaking in crowded halls, standing on street corners, and writing tirelessly. He saw that capitalism in America was even more ruthless than in Britain. Industrial giants ruled with an iron grip, crushing strikes with private armies, hiring thugs to beat down workers, and using the courts to jail union leaders. It was a war where the rich held all the weapons, and the poor were expected to accept their fate. But Connolly refused to accept it. He threw himself into organizing workers, demanding higher wages, better conditions, and dignity for the men and women who built America with their sweat and blood. One of the most radical groups at the time was the Industrial Workers of the World, IWW, known as the Wobblies. Unlike other unions that focused only on skilled laborers, the IWW embraced everyone: factory workers, miners, immigrants, women, and even the unemployed. Connolly saw in them the kind of revolutionary energy he believed in. They did not ask for small reforms, they demanded an entirely new system. They wanted to bring down capitalism itself. It was an idea that spoke to Connolly's core beliefs. But the fight was brutal. Strikes often turned into battlefields. Police and company guards attacked unarmed workers. Newspapers painted union leaders as dangerous anarchists, and the government sided with the factory owners. Connolly saw workers shot, beaten, and thrown into prison for daring to ask for a living wage. Yet he also saw resilience. He saw men and women who refused to be broken, who marched in the streets even when their voices were drowned out by police batons, who carried on the struggle even when their leaders were locked away. Connolly's time in America hardened him. He had always believed in the power of workers to rise up, but now he saw the cost of that struggle more clearly than ever. He wrote fiercely, calling for revolution, for a world where workers ruled, where wealth was shared, where no man starved while another grew fat on his labor. His words were bold, defiant, and dangerous. Employers blacklisted him. The authorities watched him closely. But Connolly did not care. He had not come to America to make peace with the system. He had come to fight it. Yet, despite his passion, Connolly was restless. America had taught him valuable lessons, but his heart remained in Ireland. He knew that the same forces crushing workers in Chicago, Pittsburgh, and New York were at work in Dublin and Belfast. And he knew that the fight for Ireland's freedom was entering a new and dangerous phase. He had seen workers unite in America. Now he wanted to bring that fire back home. In 1910, Connolly made his decision. He would return to Ireland, not just as a socialist, but as a revolutionary leader. The fight he had seen in America had reinforced one undeniable truth: there could be no freedom without the workers, and there could be no workers' revolution without national freedom. The two were one struggle, and James Connolly was ready to lead it. Part 6, Back to Ireland. Founding the Irish Citizen Army, James Connolly returned to Ireland in 1910, a man transformed by the battles he had fought in America. He had seen the brutality of capitalism on an even larger scale, and he had witnessed workers standing their ground against overwhelming odds. But now his fight was back home. Ireland was still shackled by British rule, but Connolly knew that political freedom alone would mean nothing if workers remained in chains. The struggle for Irish independence had to be a struggle for social justice as well. And he was determined to lead it. Dublin in the early 1910s was a city of extremes. The wealthy elite lived in luxury, while the working class endured grinding poverty, disease, and starvation. Tenement houses were overcrowded, children went barefoot in the streets, and families survived on scraps. Employers like William Martin Murphy, a ruthless businessman and newspaper tycoon, held total control over workers' lives. If they dared to demand better wages or conditions, they were fired and blacklisted. Connolly saw the cruelty of it all, and he would not stand by in silence. He threw himself into the labor movement, taking up leadership in the Irish Transport and General Workers Union, ITGW, alongside Jim Larkin. Together, they became the voices of the working class, rallying thousands to demand their rights. But their defiance came at a cost. In 1913, Dublin exploded into one of the most vicious labor struggles in Irish history, the Dublin lockout. For months, tens of thousands of workers were locked out of their jobs for joining the ITGW. Employers, backed by the British authorities, refused to negotiate. Starvation loomed over the workers' families. Police batons rained down on peaceful protesters. The newspapers turned public opinion against them, portraying them as radicals trying to tear Ireland apart. But Connolly and Larkin refused to surrender. As the lockout escalated, Connolly saw a dangerous truth. Workers were not just being attacked economically, but physically. The police acted as enforcers for the business elite, breaking up meetings, arresting union leaders, and beating men, women, and children in the streets. The workers had no protection, no force to defend them. And that was when Connolly had an idea. If the state would not protect them, they would protect themselves. In November 1913, Connolly and Larkin founded the Irish Citizen Army, ICA. It was not just a Union defense force, it was a revolutionary army, created to fight for the rights and dignity of the Irish working class. Membership was open to all who were willing to stand up for justice, regardless of background. They trained with whatever weapons they could find, drilling in fields and back alleys, preparing for the moment when workers would have to take a stand, not just with words, but with arms. For Connolly, the ICA was more than just a militia, it was a symbol of the new Ireland he envisioned. An Ireland where the working class would not simply beg for crumbs from the rich, but would seize their own destiny. He made it clear that this was no mere protest movement. The ICA was being prepared for a greater struggle, a struggle not only against the employers, but against the British state itself. As tensions continued to rise, Connolly's beliefs hardened. He was no longer just a socialist leader, he was now a revolutionary commander. He saw that the future of Ireland could not be won through strikes alone. It would take armed resistance. And when that moment came, he knew the Irish Citizen Army would be ready. Part 7, Against Two Enemies, Fighting for Workers and National Freedom. By 1914, James Connolly stood at a crossroads. He had spent years fighting for workers' rights, leading strikes, and building the Irish Citizen Army. But now he saw that the battle could not be won through labor struggles alone. A greater war was on the horizon, one that would determine the fate of Ireland itself. Connolly was not just fighting against ruthless employers anymore. He was fighting against an empire. The outbreak of World War I changed everything. Thousands of Irishmen were sent to die on foreign battlefields, told they were fighting for the freedom of small nations. But Connolly saw the hypocrisy. How could Britain claim to defend freedom abroad while keeping Ireland in chains? The war was an opportunity, and he knew it. If Britain was distracted by conflict in Europe, Irish revolutionaries could strike while its grip was weakened. Connolly was ready to take that risk. He intensified his attacks on both capitalism and British rule, making it clear that the two were inseparable. Employers like William Martin Murphy crushed workers with starvation wages, while British soldiers patrolled the streets, ensuring that the social order remained unchanged. Connolly's fiery speeches called for action. He declared that only through armed insurrection could the working class and the Irish people break free from their oppressors. But he was not just talking, he was planning. The Irish Citizen Army, once a defense force for striking workers, was now being transformed into a revolutionary army. Connolly drilled his men relentlessly, knowing they would soon face a far greater enemy than Dublin's police. They trained with rifles, learned guerrilla tactics, and prepared for a war that many still believed was impossible. Connolly was not a man of half measures. He was ready to fight, and he was ready to die. But he could not do it alone. He knew that if the revolution was to succeed, it had to be bigger than just the workers' movement. He needed allies. And that was when his path crossed with the Irish Republican Brotherhood, IRB. The IRB, a secret nationalist organization, had been plotting an armed uprising for years. But they lacked a clear vision of what kind of Ireland they were fighting for. Connolly had that vision. And so, despite their ideological differences, a pact was formed. Connolly's involvement with the IRB marked a turning point. He was no longer just a socialist leader. He was now a key figure in the revolutionary movement. He pushed the nationalists to act, warning that hesitation would lead to failure. The time for speeches and empty promises was over. The time for revolution had come. As Easter 1916 approached, Connolly moved with urgency. He knew that the odds were against them. The British military was the most powerful in the world, and an Irish rebellion had little chance of military success. But Connolly was not fighting for victory in the traditional sense. He was fighting to ignite a spark, a fire that would spread beyond their generation, beyond their lives. By the time the final plans for the Easter Rising were set in motion, Connolly had cemented his place in history. He was no longer just a Union leader, nor just a revolutionary. He was both. A man who understood that Ireland's freedom and the workers' struggle were one and the same. He was about to enter the most defining moment of his life, a battle that would either destroy him or make him immortal. Part 8. The Road to Rebellion, Connolly and the Irish Republican Brotherhood. By late 1915, James Connolly was running out of patience. He had spent years warning that speeches and protests would never free Ireland, and now, with Britain distracted by war, the moment had come. But hesitation threatened to kill the revolution before it even began. The Irish Republican Brotherhood (IRB), though committed to an armed uprising, moved cautiously, afraid of acting too soon. Connolly had no such fear. He believed that if they waited any longer, they would lose their only chance. Connolly's secret meetings with the IRB were filled with tension. The nationalist leaders admired his courage, but they saw him as reckless, a man willing to risk everything without guarantee of success. Connolly, in turn, saw them as hesitant, too afraid to seize the moment. He clashed with their leaders, insisting that the rebellion had to be more than just a symbolic act. It had to be a real attempt at revolution. He knew the odds were against them, but he also knew that waiting would only ensure failure. His defiance forced the IRB's hand. Some believed he was too unpredictable, and even considered eliminating him if he acted alone. But Connolly had something they lacked: an army. His Irish citizen army, though small, was disciplined, armed, and ready to fight. The IRB could not afford to lose him. Instead of stopping him, they brought him deeper into the conspiracy. In January 1916, Connolly was secretly sworn into the IRB's military council. In a matter of weeks, he had gone from being an outsider to one of the key architects of the coming rebellion. With Connolly now at the heart of the plan, the nature of the rising changed. He did not fight simply for an independent Ireland. He fought for a workers' republic. Many within the IRB saw the rebellion as a means to end British rule, but Connolly envisioned something far greater. He wanted a revolution that would overthrow not just the British, but the entire system that had kept the Irish poor and oppressed. This put him at odds with some of his allies, but Connolly never compromised on his ideals. He declared that "we will strike in the name of the dead generations," knowing full well that they might not live to see victory. As the weeks passed, Connolly's urgency only grew. He intensified training for the Irish Citizen Army, drilling them as if war were imminent. He met with other leaders of the rebellion, pressing them to act before it was too late. To some, his insistence felt like desperation. To Connolly, it was clarity. He had no illusions about the challenge ahead. Britain had the most powerful army in the world, and a poorly armed Irish uprising stood little chance of military success. But that was not the point. The rebellion was meant to spark something larger, a flame that could not be extinguished. By the eve of the rising, Connolly was a man transformed. The weight of what was to come rested on his shoulders, but he did not waver. He spent the final hours in deep discussion with his comrades, finalizing plans and preparing for battle. When the time came, there would be no turning back. The road to rebellion had reached its end. Now there was only war. Part 9. Easter's Fire. The rising begins in the streets of Dublin. April 24, 1916, Easter Monday. As Dubliners went about their mourning, few realized that history was about to be rewritten in fire and blood. From the outskirts of the city, columns of armed men began to march. They carried rifles, some old and unreliable, others smuggled from Germany. At their head was James Connolly, his expression steeled with resolve. Today was the day they would strike. Today Ireland would rise. By midday, Connolly and his men stormed the General Post Office, GPO, on Sackville Street. It would become the heart of the rebellion, its walls a fortress against the might of the British Empire. The Irish tricolour was raised above the building, and within its halls Connolly took command. Though Patrick Pearse was the official leader of the rebellion, it was Connolly's iron will that ensured order. He moved among the men, barking instructions, ensuring that the rebel army did not descend into chaos. There would be no looting, no senseless destruction. This was not anarchy, this was revolution. Outside, Dubliners gathered, watching in shock as armed rebels seized strategic locations. City Hall, St. Stephen's Green, Boland's Mills, all fell under the control of the Irish volunteers and the Irish Citizen Army. Some bystanders cheered, believing Ireland was finally casting off British rule. Others jeered, cursing the rebels for disrupting their lives. Many were simply confused. Was this a protest? A military exercise? The British authorities were just as uncertain. For the first few hours, they hesitated, failing to grasp the scale of the uprising. That hesitation would cost them dearly. As Pearse stepped outside the GPO, he read aloud the proclamation of the Irish Republic. His voice was firm, but the real declaration of war was not in words. It was in Connolly's relentless military preparation. Under his orders, rebels erected barricades, smashed windows to create sniper nests, and turned the city into a battlefield. He understood that their survival depended on discipline. There was no room for hesitation, no time for doubt. By afternoon, the first shots were fired. British soldiers, finally realizing the gravity of the situation, advanced toward rebel positions. Connolly, ever the strategist, directed fire from the GPO, ordering his men to hold their ground. Despite their limited numbers, the rebels fought with deadly precision. British officers fell in the streets, and for a moment, it seemed as if Connolly's forces had the upper hand. But as the hours passed, the British response grew stronger. They poured reinforcements into Dublin, and the sound of machine guns echoed through the streets. The rebels fought with determination, yet they were hopelessly outnumbered. Connolly, wounded but undeterred, continued to give orders, refusing to let pain slow him down. Blood stained his uniform, but his voice remained steady. He had known from the start that this battle was more than just a military campaign. It was a message. Even if they fell, Ireland would remember. Even if they lost, the fire had been lit. As night fell over Dublin, the city burned. The streets ran red with the price of revolution. Connolly, still defiant, prepared for the long fight ahead. The rising had begun, and there would be no turning back. Part 10. Holding the Line. The battle at the General Post Office. The walls of the General Post Office trembled under the relentless bombardment. British artillery had arrived in full force, and with it, the true weight of the Empire's wrath. The rebels inside, battered and exhausted, braced for the next assault. Smoke filled the corridors, gunfire echoed through the shattered windows, and James Connolly, wounded but unbowed, continued to command. He refused to leave his men, his body failing but his voice as sharp as ever. Lying on a stretcher, he directed the battle, barking orders between grimaces of pain. His dream of an Irish republic was slipping through his fingers, but surrender was not yet an option. Beyond the walls, Dublin had become a city of fire and ruin. British troops, now fully mobilized, closed in from all directions. Machine guns rattled from rooftops, cutting down rebels who dared to peek from cover. Snipers on both sides engaged in deadly duels, perched high above the streets where chaos reigned below. Barricades erected days earlier were now little more than debris, trampled beneath the boots of advancing soldiers. Yet, inside the GPO, Connolly's men fought on, clinging to the last vestiges of their stronghold. The heat was unbearable. Flames licked at the wooden beams, the ceiling groaned under the weight of destruction, and the air grew thick with suffocating smoke. The walls, once symbols of defiance, were now crumbling under British shellfire. Rebels coughed, their eyes burning, their bodies drenched in sweat as they scrambled to hold their positions. Ammunition ran dangerously low. Food and water were all but gone. The wounded lay in agony, their moans drowned out by the deafening roar of explosions. The reality of their situation was inescapable. This was not a battle they could win. Connolly knew it too. Yet, even in the face of certain defeat, his spirit remained unbroken. Propped up by his comrades, his face streaked with blood and soot, he spoke to his men. "Hold fast," he urged, his voice raw but unwavering. "We fight not for ourselves, but for the generations yet to come." His words, though spoken through clenched teeth, reignited the fire in their hearts. If they were to fall, they would fall as revolutionaries. If the dream of a free Ireland was to die, it would not die without a fight. But reality was merciless. By Friday, the GPO was a death trap. The ceiling collapsed in a fiery cascade, forcing the rebels to retreat into the streets. They staggered through the ruins, carrying the wounded, Connolly among them. Smoke choked the city, gunfire rang out in every direction, and the once proud headquarters of the rebellion now stood as a burning husk. The battle for the GPO was over. The fight for Ireland, however, was far from finished. Part 11. Crushed but unbroken. The bloody aftermath of the Rising. Dublin lay in ruin. Smoke still curled from the remains of O'Connell Street, the wreckage of the General Post Office, a haunting shell of what had once been the heart of rebellion. The uprising was over, and the rebels, those who had not fallen in battle, were now hunted men. British forces swept through the city, rounding up anyone suspected of involvement. Many were beaten in the streets, dragged from hiding places, or arrested on mere suspicion. Martial law had been declared, and the iron grip of the Empire was closing tightly around Ireland. James Connolly, gravely wounded, was among the captured. He was barely conscious as British soldiers carried him on a stretcher to Dublin Castle, his body shattered but his defiance unbroken. Blood seeped through his bandages, his face was pale, but his spirit remained unyielding. Though his enemies saw him as a defeated man, Connolly himself refused to believe the dream of Irish freedom had died. He had fought knowing the cost, and now, as he lay in the custody of his enemies, he understood that his sacrifice had only begun. Beyond the prisons and the barracks, the mood in Dublin was shifting. At first, many civilians had cursed the rebels, blaming them for the destruction and the deaths of innocent bystanders. Families mourned, businesses were lost, and food was scarce. But as British troops tightened their hold, dragging men from their homes and imposing ruthless order, anger toward the rebels gave way to something new. Resentment toward the Empire. The people of Ireland had seen revolts crushed before, but this time, something was different. The Rising had ignited a flame, and with every act of brutality by the British, that flame grew stronger. The first military trials were swift and merciless. The rebel leaders were brought before court-martials with no real defense, their fate decided before a word was spoken. Connolly, too weak to stand, was questioned from his stretcher. There was no doubt about his sentence. Death, The British authorities were determined to make an example of the leaders, to stamp out any lingering hope of rebellion. But instead, they were sowing the seeds of something far greater. Word of the executions spread quickly. One by one, the leaders of the rising were taken into the yard of Kilmainham jail and shot by firing squad. The sound of gunfire echoed through the prison walls, each volley sending ripples of shock through the nation. With every death, public opinion turned. These men were no longer seen as reckless insurgents, they were martyrs. Their blood stained the courtyard, but their sacrifice burned itself into the heart of Ireland. And Connolly still waited, still breathed, still refused to break. He knew his fate was coming. He had given everything for the dream of a free Ireland, and if death was the price, he would pay it. As he lay in his prison bed, the pain was nothing compared to the knowledge that Ireland's fight was not over. The rising had been crushed, but the spirit of rebellion had never been stronger. And the Empire was about to make one final mistake. Part 12, Facing Death. Connolly's Capture and Trial. James Connolly lay in a darkened cell, the damp walls pressing in around him. The pain in his shattered body was unrelenting, his legs swollen and infected, yet his mind remained sharp. He had long accepted his fate, but the weight of unfinished dreams bore down upon him. The rising had failed, but had it truly been in vain? He had fought not for personal glory, not for the fleeting victories of war, but for the workers, for the downtrodden, for the Ireland that had yet to be free. His body was broken, but his spirit was not. He had always known this was how it might end. Outside the walls of Dublin Castle, the city was changing. The British had expected swift condemnation of the rebels, yet something different was happening. As news spread of the summary executions, the tide of public opinion began to turn. Once, many had viewed Connolly and his comrades as reckless idealists, leading Ireland to ruin. Now, with each dawn bringing another volley of gunfire, the people began to see them as something else, martyrs. Connolly had always believed that if the workers could see the truth, they would rise. Perhaps in death, he would reach them in ways he never could in life. Connolly's trial was little more than a formality. He was too weak to stand, his body ravaged by infection, yet the court-martial proceeded with cold efficiency. British officers sat stiffly, reading out charges of treason and rebellion, while Connolly listened from his cot, his face pale but resolute. When asked if he had anything to say, he did not beg for mercy. He did not ask for leniency. Instead, his voice, though faint, carried the same unwavering conviction it always had. The cause of labor is the cause of Ireland. The cause of Ireland is the cause of labor. They cannot be dissevered. The verdict was predetermined. Death by firing squad. Even as the sentence was read, Connolly remained defiant. He had long known this moment would come. He had marched into battle with the weight of history on his shoulders, and now he would meet his end as others had before him, boldly, without fear. To Connolly, this was not defeat. He had done what he could with the time he had been given. He had fought, not only with bullets but with words, with ideas, with a vision that could not be silenced with a single command. But the British had a dilemma. Connolly was too weak to stand. His wounds had worsened, the fever consuming what little strength he had left. If they carried him to the execution yard, the sight of a dying man being shot would surely turn even more against them. Yet the order had been given, and the Empire would not be defied. They dragged him from his cot, tied him to a chair, and propped him up so that the bullets would strike clean. Even then, he did not waver. His final moments were not of regret, but of certainty. As soldiers prepared for the final act, Connolly lay in his cell, staring at the cracked ceiling. The pain no longer mattered. The fear no longer mattered. Only the dream remained. He had given everything for it, and soon, he would give his life. And as the bullets tore through him in the gray morning light, James Connolly's body fell, but his dream took flight. It would not die in that yard. it would carry forward, igniting something far greater than a single battle. In death, he had won what he could not in life. He had become the rallying cry for a nation on the verge of awakening. Part 13. A Martyr's Echo. How Connolly's death inspired a nation. The streets of Dublin, once littered with the rubble of the Easter Rising, now bore a different kind of weight, the silent anger of a people who had begun to see the truth. When the rebellion ended in fire and surrender, the British authorities believed they had stamped out the embers of defiance. They saw the executions as a necessity, a brutal but effective means of ending any further resistance. Yet, as each fallen leader was dragged before a firing squad, something irreversible happened. The people of Ireland, many of whom had been indifferent or even hostile to the rising, began to see the rebels not as reckless agitators, but as martyrs. And among them, none loomed larger than James Connolly. His execution had not been swift. Wounded, feverish, and barely able to move, he had been tied to a chair to face his end. The image of a dying man being shot in cold blood was seared into the Irish consciousness. It was not just an execution, it was a warning. But instead of silencing the cause, it breathed new life into it. Public sentiment, once fractured, now began to shift in ways the British had not anticipated. In homes and meeting halls across the country, conversations turned from quiet grief to whispered defiance. If they could do this to Connolly, what would they do to the rest of us? The brutality of his death had given him a second life, one not bound by flesh, but by memory and purpose. He had fought not just for Ireland's freedom, but for its workers, its poor, its forgotten souls. And in death he had become their symbol. For those who had marched with Connolly, the pain of his loss was immeasurable. His comrades in the Irish Citizen Army spoke of him not just as a leader, but as a father to the cause. He did not die for nothing, one of them swore. We will make sure of that. The rage over his execution spread beyond Dublin, reaching the farthest corners of Ireland. The British had hoped the rebellion would die with its leaders, but they had only ensured its rebirth. The political landscape shifted like a tide coming to shore. In the 1918 general election, Sinn Féin, now seen as the torchbearer of the Rising's ideals, won a sweeping victory. The path to independence had been paved with blood, but it was moving forward. By 1919, the War of Independence had begun. The rebellion that had seemed to end in failure was now the foundation of a new fight, a fight that Connolly had long foreseen. Beyond Ireland, Connolly's dream continued to stir minds. His writings on socialism and workers' rights found new audiences, inspiring labor movements in Scotland, the United States, and beyond. He had always believed that the fight for freedom and the fight for social justice were one and the same. And though he would never see the Ireland he envisioned, his ideas refused to fade. Years passed, but his presence never left. His words were quoted in the streets, his ideals woven into the nation's fabric. In moments of crisis, in times of struggle, Connolly's voice seemed to echo through the generations. The British had hoped to erase him, but instead, they had ensured that James Connolly would never truly die. His dream had survived, and it continued to shape Ireland's destiny. Part 14. Dreams That Never Die, The Legacy of James Connolly. The echoes of James Connolly's vision did not fade with the gunfire that ended his life. Instead, they grew louder, carried through generations that saw in his struggle a reflection of their own. He had not only fought for Ireland's freedom, but had envisioned a nation built on justice, equality, and the empowerment of the working class. His execution may have silenced his voice, but it could not silence his ideas. They became immortal, woven into the very fabric of Ireland's revolutionary spirit. In the years following his death, Connolly's influence shaped the course of Irish politics. The Easter Rising, once viewed with skepticism by many, was now revered as the spark that ignited the push for independence. By 1922, after years of guerrilla warfare and political struggle, Ireland had gained its freedom, at least in part. The Irish Free State was born, yet it was not the socialist republic Connolly had envisioned. Partition had divided the island, and the working class, for whom he had sacrificed everything, remained oppressed in many ways. But Connolly's dream did not die with independence. His writings became the foundation for labor movements that demanded better conditions for workers, fair wages, and social protections. He had long believed that political freedom without economic justice was meaningless, and his followers carried that belief forward. The Irish Labour Party, which Connolly had played a role in shaping, continued to fight for the rights of the working class. Trade unions across Ireland invoked his name, as they organized strikes and protests. The revolution he had spoken of was still ongoing, not on the battlefield, but in the factories, in the streets, and in the hearts of the people. Beyond Ireland, Connolly's influence stretched far and wide. His ideas on socialism and workers' rights resonated in labor movements across the world. From Scotland to the United States, his writings were studied by those who sought to challenge economic inequality. His belief that true freedom could only be achieved when workers controlled their own destinies inspired movements far beyond the shores of Ireland. In Cuba and South America, in Eastern Europe, Connolly's vision found new voices, proving that his ideas were not confined to one nation, but belonged to all who resisted oppression. Even in Northern Ireland, where division and conflict persisted for decades, Connolly's words held weight. During the civil rights movements of the 1960s and the troubles that followed, both nationalists and socialists turned to his teachings. He had warned that partition would lead to continued strife, and history had proven him right. Yet his belief in unity across class, religion, and nationality remained an ideal that many still aspired to. In modern Ireland, Connolly's legacy is everywhere. His name is spoken in classrooms, his words are studied in universities, his life is honored in memorials. Statues stand in his memory, and his face appears on murals that remind the people of the fight he waged. Every May Day, as workers march for their rights, they invoke his name, remembering that their struggle is not new but part of a long battle for justice. James Connolly was not just a revolutionary, not just a soldier, not just a martyr. He was a man who saw a better future and dared to fight for it. And though he did not live to see that future, his dreams did not die with him. They live on in every call for justice, in every fight against oppression, in every step toward a fairer world. James Connolly may have fallen, but his vision remains as powerful and unyielding as ever. Part 15. James Connolly, the man who dared to dream. James Connolly's legacy is not confined to history books, nor is his name merely a footnote in Ireland's long struggle for freedom. He remains a symbol of defiance, of hope, and of a vision that stretched beyond political independence to true social justice. To understand Connolly is to understand a man who dared to dream, not just of an Ireland free from British rule, but of a society where the working class would rise, where economic oppression would be shattered, and where all people, regardless of background, would have dignity. Born into poverty, Connolly's life was a constant battle against the chains that bound the working class. From the sweat-stained factories of Scotland to the streets of Dublin, where he led workers in strikes and protests, his dream of a just society was forged in struggle. He was no ordinary revolutionary. He was a thinker, a writer, a soldier, and above all, a believer in the power of the people. Unlike many of his contemporaries, Connolly did not separate the fight for national freedom from the fight for workers' rights. He saw them as one and the same, an unbreakable cause that could not be won if only one battle was fought. As the leader of the Irish Citizen Army, he trained men not just in the art of war, but in the principles of solidarity and justice. He stood at the heart of the Easter Rising, knowing that defeat was almost certain, but believing that sacrifice would inspire the future. And he was right. The blood of Connolly and his comrades did not quench the flames of revolution, it spread them. Within a few short years of his execution, Ireland was on its path to independence. His belief that a single moment of struggle could awaken a nation proved prophetic. Yet his death left a void. The republic he had envisioned did not immediately come to pass. Ireland remained divided, and economic inequalities persisted. But Connolly's words did not die with him. They endured, shaping labor movements, inspiring future leaders, and reminding generations of Irish men and women that the fight for justice does not end with political freedom. It continues in the streets, in the workplaces, and in the very fabric of society. Across the world, Connolly's legacy has found new voices. In labor movements from the United States to Latin America, in anti-colonial struggles from Africa to Asia, his writings have been studied, his ideas debated, his strategies admired. He was not merely an Irish hero. He was a global revolutionary, a man whose dreams reach far beyond the land of his birth. Today, his name still carries weight. His vision still challenges the world to do better. His sacrifice, once seen as a tragic end, is now understood as the beginning of a new chapter in Ireland's history. Statues stand in his honor, murals bear his image, and every May Day, workers march in his name. But the true testament to James Connolly is not found in stone or paint. It is found in every movement that seeks fairness, in every worker who demands dignity, in every voice that rises against injustice. James Connolly dared to dream. And though he did not live to see it realized, his dream did not die. It endures unbroken, unyielding, and waiting for the day it will finally come to pass. Thanks for tuning in to Historical Legacies. If you enjoyed this dive into history, please like, subscribe, and share. Join us next time for more fascinating stories from the past.